Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo.
On the last Great Wahoo, we went discovering the world's greatest river floods. There have been two of them. We began with the second greatest flood ever. We went checking out what is now the Great Salt Lake, and it's called a Great Lake because, indeed, it is a very large lake. In fact, it's the 37th largest lake in the world. But 15,000 years ago, it was a little more impressive. It was called Lake Bonneville. The Northwest was a much wetter place at the time, and the great basin that Salt Lake is in filled and filled. There are no outlets to this basin. The only reason the Salt Lake stays where it's at is because of evaporation. Of course, if you fill a bathtub full enough, it eventually will find a place to run over. And Lake Bonneville found that point at what we call Red Rock Pass. In our last episode, we saw that Red Rock Pass had 300 feet of soft gravel and sand. At some point, this soft gravel and sand weakened. Perhaps water started running through it. Perhaps it was an extra heavy water year and more water flowed over. But at some point, it began to wash out. And once it began to wash out, it washed out very quickly. A plug 3 times the size of the main fill at Lucky Peak Dam suddenly gave way. Not only was there 3 times the size of the plug of Lucky Peak Dam, there was much more water. Last week we took a look at what a cubic mile of water means. 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile. It's a lot of water. Usually we measure water by acre feet, which is 1 acre, 1 foot deep. Lucky Peak has 300,000 acre feet of water in it. That means all the water behind Lucky Peak is less than 9% of 1 cubic mile. Yet, when the dam gave out at Red Rock Pass, it drained 600 cubic miles of water, about half as much water as Lake Michigan. The water ran so high that if you were standing at the canyon at Twin Falls, the canyon would be full of water, and the water would be going up over the brim of the canyon. There was so much water that it ran this full for 90 days. Then, of course, as the lake went down, it became less and less, running at a flood level for a year. On our last episode, we also spent a little time looking at the phenomena we call melon gravel, which are common throughout the Snake River Plain, but are very rare in the world. These boulders, weighing up to 1.5 tons, were ripped from the canyon walls and tumbled along the bottom of the canyons like so much sand being pushed by water. What looks like thousands of years of erosion was actually accomplished in mere minutes. Well, the story of the world's second largest flood was certainly interesting. But it was, after all, the second largest flood ever. So, what about the greatest flood ever? Well, folks, for the greatest river flood ever in the geologic history of Earth, we need only go a few hundred miles north. The place was at Clark Fork, Idaho, at the east end of Lake Pend Oreille. The time was between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. Yes, the same time as the Bonneville flood. Glaciers from the polar ice cap came all the way down into North Idaho and formed an ice dam at Clark Fork. This ice dam backed water up into Montana, surrounding Missoula, and up all the way to Butte. To wrap our heads around what happened at Lake Missoula, let's compare it with the Lake Bonneville flood. Lake Bonneville was the second largest flood on record, and Lake Missoula is the largest. They both happened about the same time. One difference is that Lake Missoula was caused by an ice dam that kept reforming. Therefore, there were floods after floods after floods. To date, we have established that there were more than 40 of these repeated floods as the ice dam formed and was washed out. The total amount of water drained was about the same. Lake Bonneville, of course, still had a huge lake left after its one flood. Every time Lake Missoula drained, it drained the entire lake. Just about half as much water as in Lake Michigan. And here the similarities end. The length of the dam at Red Rock Pass was 3/4 of a mile. The length of the ice dam at Clark Fork was 23 miles. The height of the dam at Red Rock Pass that washed out during the Bonneville flood was 300 feet. Not only was the ice dam at Clark Fork 23 miles wide, it was 2,000 feet tall. So, if we go back and we look at the main fill at Lucky Peak Dam, and we represent the size of Lucky Peak Dam on a graph, we get something that looks like this. The earth dam that washed out at Red Rock Pass and caused the Bonneville flood was 3 times as wide as the main fill at Lucky Peak and about the same height. On the graph, it looks about like this. At 23 miles wide and 2,000 feet high, the ice dam that repeatedly gave way and caused the Missoula floods would look something like this. You can imagine what happens when a dam that is 23 miles wide and 2,000 feet tall suddenly gives way. While the flood from Lake Bonneville lasted several months, the floods from Lake Missoula each lasted only a few days. And while the flood from Lake Bonneville was an astonishing 3/4 of a cubic mile per hour running down the Snake River, the waters that were unleashed from Lake Missoula released 8 to 10 cubic miles of water an hour onto eastern Washington. Considering the amount of water that was falling on western Montana at the time, it would take 4 to 8 decades to build the ice dam and fill it. Of course, the deeper water gets, the more pressure it is exerting on whatever it is pushing against. One of the properties of ice is that as the pressure on it increases, the melting point of ice decreases. So what we had was an ice dam that grew taller and taller as the pressures behind it began to weaken the base of the dam. The critical point, where it weakened the dam so much that it gave way, was when the dam was about 2,000 feet tall. And that is why, again and again and again, more than 40 times that we know of, this great Missoula flood was unleashed into eastern Washington and washed down the Columbia River. The result is what in eastern Washington we call the scrublands. It has scrubbed the land right down to the rock. And even the rocks have been formed into great gullies, what we call coulees. Of course, these coulees are of different sizes. The Grand Coulee, right along the Columbia River, is today the location of a rather famous dam. Another great effect of all these floods coming through eastern Washington is that all the soil and loam of eastern Washington was washed away. Of course, there were places where there were narrows that the Columbia River flowed through. At one of these narrows, the river backed up and formed Lake Columbia, which then drained as the river went down. There were several places throughout the drainage that the water was backed up and it would deposit some of the silt and sand that it had collected in eastern Washington. One of the most influential of these places where the water was backed up was at what we now call Kalama, Washington. The river is squeezed into a 1-mile wide narrows at this spot. Because this narrows was slowing down the flood backed up into the Willamette Valley. In fact, it backed all the way to Eugene and beyond. And that is why people took the Oregon Trail to go claim their farm in some of the richest soil in the nation. All of this rich soil that had been picked up from eastern Washington and was deposited between the coastal and the Cascade Mountain ranges of western Oregon. And that, folks, is the story of the two greatest flooding rivers that have ever occurred in the geologic history of Earth that we have found. Two phenomenal floods that both occurred because of collapsing dams at opposite ends of this bizarre state we call Idaho. And now, some considerations about telling stories of great floods. Well, taking on something as large as the world's largest floods does leave a few questions that I thought that I would address. First of all, there is the question of, well, how do we really know that these are the world's largest floods? And secondly, there's the question, why do I keep talking of river floods? Obviously, there are different kinds of floods, and I insist on calling and talking about the river floods. So let's look at those two different things that we've touched on, shall we? First of all, let's look at whether these are the biggest river floods in the geologic history. Of course, all we have is what is written in stones. So many floods happened long before human history began to be recorded, that all that we have is what is written in the sands of time, literally. So let's look at this greatest flood in the history, which was the Missoula flood. It really wasn't until the 1920s that it was even proposed that there could have been a great flood. All the way through human history, people have seen floods and people have seen the results of floods. However, the Missoula flood was so huge and covered such a huge territory. There were these huge boulders in the Willamette Valley that it took a little while to figure out that, gee, this boulder came from eastern Washington. How did that happen? So it wasn't until the 1920s when a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz figured this out. And he came up with this theory that there was a great flood that washed eastern Washington into western Oregon. Needless to say, there were a great many skeptics. Where would all that water come from? How would it make it through the gorges? How could this possibly be true? By 1925, however, another geologist, Joseph Pardee, joined in the chase. And between them, they pretty well went looking for, well, where would the water be? Well, they found water lines all around Missoula, all around western Montana. They also found a place where the water line stopped. Sure enough, it's where an ice dam would have been building up during an ice age. And from that spot forward, there were signs of flood. So they worked and worked. They gathered more and more evidence until finally the scientific community said, well, that's pretty hard to refute. Now, science is a curious thing, just like anything else. Once you invent the wheel, everybody has the wheel. Once you invent the telephone, people who had never thought they would ever even dream of a telephone, much less needing one, in a very short time, telephones are everywhere. In science, once you figure out something and how to look for it, of course, all the other scientists immediately go looking in their backyard. So, from the 30s to 40s, when this theory became pretty well established, scientists throughout the world have been looking in their own backyards all over the earth for exactly similar circumstances. To date, the flood at Missoula and the flood of Lake Bonneville are the two largest floods that we have found in the geologic record. In the 80 years since then, it's very likely that if there had been larger ones, they would have been discovered by now. So, at least according to our current understanding, we can quite definitely say that these are the two largest river floods that have ever happened on the face of our good earth. Now, it's possible, of course, that in the prehistory that we do not have access to in the geologic records, another flood happened that was larger. Plate tectonics make it so that the earth is constantly shifting and pieces of earth are always going down underneath other pieces of earth. And it's possible on one of these plates of the earth, there was evidence of a river flood that has been lost to geologists. However, of the geology that is on the earth today, of the geographic world that we have to look at, the Missoula floods and the Bonneville flood are the first and second largest floods in the history. An interesting thing for them to happen so close together. It really is rather bizarre. Now let's think of the second aspect. There are, of course, floods other than river floods. Most of the records we have, other than tsunamis, are that floods are river floods, of course, because we build our civilizations on rivers. We need the water. However, there have been other floods. One of the greatest of these, which there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of scuba diving out to prove, and I don't know the latest development on all this, but I remember reading about it a while back. And that was when the Mediterranean Sea opened up. When the plates of the world were much, much more crammed together, the plate that is the Americas was crammed up against Africa, and Africa was crammed down on the top of by Europe. There was kind of one big continental mass, and where the Mediterranean Sea was probably a depression, maybe even below sea level at that early stage, kind of like the Dead Sea is now. However, there was no water in it. As Africa and Europe began to separate, the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, that big hole got bigger and bigger. And then there was one point at which this narrow, narrow little place that we today call Gibraltar, the Strait of Gibraltar, got to where it got so opened up that the Atlantic Sea was able to start pouring into this big hole. It started small, of course, and whatever could wash out did quite quickly. That water rushed in and filled what we now call the Mediterranean Sea. That was a lot of water, folks. That was probably many, many, many times the size of Lake Michigan, much less half the water that's in Lake Michigan. I'll do a little research and see if I can't come up with some numbers for you. So that would have been a great flood, and it could be argued a greater flood than the two floods we've been looking at. However, it was an ocean flood, not a river flood. A further extension of that is when this Mediterranean Sea kept filling up and filling up and filling up to where it found the Strait of Bosphorus. The Strait of Bosphorus is where the sea broke through into what we now call the Black Sea. Now, apparently, this happened fairly recently. It has been speculated by the person who discovered this that the flooding of the Black Sea may have been where the story of Noah's Ark and the great flood of Noah's Ark came from. It's hard to say. We're speculating here because the stories were told by oral tradition for so long. However, there are two things going on with the opening of the Black Sea. For one thing, the Black Sea is a very, very large open plain with no outlet to the sea. And it did have civilization on it from the story that I understood of when the Black Sea opened up. So when the Strait of Bosphorus opened up, there was this stream of water going down and filling a hole. The Strait of Bosphorus is so narrow that not a lot of water could pour through at once. The second aspect of this is that the Black Sea is so shallow. It's like the Salt Lake. It is so shallow that the water just keeps pushing out and pushing out and pushing out. There are accounts of the people living on it would pick up their belongings and move because this body of water that they had been living on since their grandparents could remember and their great-great-grandparents could remember, suddenly just started moving up on them. Well, they didn't think too much about it. It would overfill before, and then it would go down depending on the rainy season or the dry season. But they just kept having to move back. And pretty soon the town that they had moved out of, that they were ready to move back into when the dry season came, was all the way underwater. And still, they had to keep moving back because this narrow little place where the Mediterranean Sea was pouring in was only allowing so much water, and it had so big an expanse to fill that it took quite a while. It took quite a while, and I would be speculating to tell you what, but maybe a year, something like that, to fill up the Black Sea. Maybe 5 years, I don't know. It was a huge, huge area, and the water was coming through a very small space. So the story of flooding the Black Sea is another huge flood story. But again, it was not a river flood. It was an ocean flood. And that is why I insisted on calling this the story of the greatest river floods in history. So I hope that answers some questions, whether you had those questions or not. Thanks for watching. And now, a beautiful story of loneliness and hope. The beautiful story of a budding romance. There was once a very lonely lady, and about the only solstice she had in life was to sit on a beautiful park bench and breathe the air and feed the pigeons and watch the squirrels. One day she was sitting on her park bench enjoying the pigeons, and she noticed a gentleman that she hadn't seen before walking down the pathway in the park, and he nodded and asked if he could join her, and she said, "Well, yes, I would like that. That would be very nice." They got to chatting, and she pointed out that, you seem to know the neighborhood so well, and yet I haven't seen you around. Are you someone I should know? And he said, "Oh my, probably not." He says, "I used to live here many years ago. In fact, I lived at the little brown stucco just down the street here on Elm. It was a beautiful house, and my wife and I had many, many wonderful times there. I have good memories of this neighborhood." "Well, my," said the lady, that's pleasant. It's odd I haven't seen you around because I've been here a long time. Where have you been?" "Well," the gentleman said rather sheepishly, well, to tell you the truth, one day my wife and I got into a terrible row, and I ended up murdering her. I have spent the last 20 years in prison, and that's why you have not seen me." "Oh my," said the lady. "Well, that is some story. I guess that explains why I haven't seen you in a bit." And, after a bit of an awkward pause, she looks at him and says, "So that means you're single?" And that's this week's Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo.